London is indeed a city for the dead as much as the living. In 1824, architect Thomas Wilson devised a design for a metropolitan sepulchre in the shape of a 94-storey high pyramid that would have had space for 5 million Londoners' dead bodies, where they may have repose and perfect security without interfering with the comfort, the health, the business, the property, or the pursuits of the living. And charging £50 per body, it would have been sited on top of Primrose Hill, and if it had been completed, probably been as iconic as Big Ben or the Houses of Parliament. But it was a pretty much non-starter, and as fanciful as it was, it addressed a huge London problem. The guarantee for all of us is death. The question is, and always has been, what to do with the bodies. In London, there are many churches, graveyards, and burial sites, but as the population exploded, it didn't have enough space to deal with its dead, and this was London's grave issue. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. The poet Longfellow wrote the following: "Hidden from all mortal eyes, deep the sunken city lies, even cities have their graves." And as London continued to modernise, particularly post-war, after the Blitz chewed up huge areas of a long-buried London, it uncovered long-buried Roman architecture, Saxon treasure troves, and many, many graves. Throughout history, religions, and different cultures, there have been many varying practices in dealing with the dead, and to avoid this being a 20-part series, I will concentrate on Christian burials in London, and we will begin this story in medieval London. Medieval burials generally followed a standard Christian procedure, but it would vary according to social rank. Burials in this period included interment without a shroud, with a shroud, which was more common, in a shallow grave, wooden coffin, lead-lined coffin, stone sarcophagus, mausoleum burials, and laying in an east-west alignment, and embalming. But for the majority, however, the standard practice was burial in a shroud without a coffin. In this era, the deathbed epitomised, if there can be one, a good death. As death became imminent, doors and windows would be open in order that the soul could be released. A priest would arrive to administer the last rites, and the dying person would be asked to declare his or her faith and to make a confession. And the burial would then take place in a churchyard. When the Black Death hit Europe in the late 1340s, it caused such devastation that it was estimated that somewhere between 30 to 60% of the population died. Indeed, the word quarantine stems from this period, with, in 1377, the city of Dubrovnik forcing visitors to the city an isolation period, which would eventually be 40 days, and it was given the name Quarantino, from the Italian for 40. And these bubonic plagues caused such numerous deaths that large communal pits were dug. One such pit is near Smithfield Market, at Charterhouse, where up to 20,000 people are believed to be buried. It spread so quickly as mammals were susceptible, and many people kept cats, hares, dogs, and rabbits. All were invariably infested with fleas, which were the carriers, and they would bite humans and spread the disease further. And the symptoms of the plague: 1 to 7 days post-exposure, a raging high temperature, pain, vomiting, gangrene, and the classic sign, the swelling of the lymph nodes, which could and would erupt. Needless to say, it was a pretty horrendous way to die. And these plagues continued through the centuries, and like the one in 1665, as Daniel Defoe in his Journey of a Plague Year describes, sick people wandering outside the city walls in a daze and falling over dead. And the local dwellers, they simply dug graves, and with a long pole, they pushed these dead bodies into these graves. Throughout history, it's also been used as a biological weapon, with Janne Berg, a Khan of the Golden Horde, attacking the city of Kaffa in present-day Ukraine in 1343 by catapulting infected dead bodies into the city. And as recently as 1940, during the Sino-Japanese War, Japanese aircraft dropped containers of fleas carrying the bubonic plague on the cities of Ningbo and Chengde in China, causing epidemic plague outbreaks. After the Reformation, intramural burial sites became fashionable, and it was a sign of position and wealth to have a family crypt, and to this end, enterprising clergymen used these sites as a source of income. At St Alphege in Greenwich, relatives paid for no fewer than 400 coffins to be placed in the rector's vault between 1718 and 1800. At the church of Peter Le Poer in Broad Street, which was demolished in 1907, the intramural burial fees in 1838 ranged from the most basic accommodation at £18 to 100 guineas for a vault for accommodation for 4. By the 16th century, space had become an issue, and it was practice for the graves to be disinterred after a period of 5 years, allowing for decomposition, and the bones were then stored in charnel houses like the one at St Paul's. Indeed, because of the sheer numbers of bodies in all the graveyards in London, the graveyard ground levels were always higher than the church foundations and the surrounding street. The closest cemetery to my flat is 5 minutes walk, and it's Bunhill Field, with approximately 120,000 interments between 1665 and 1854. It has notable internees including Daniel Defoe and William Blake. Its name, Bunhill, is a derision from Bonehill. When St Paul's Charnel House was demolished in 1549, over 1,000 carts of bones were deposited on the moor and capped with a thin layer of soil. And such was the stability of the site. It had small hills, and 3 windmills were sited here before the site was used as a burial ground. But then, things really did start to get out of control, and some of the shocking practices started to become exposed. Between 1800 and 1900, with the Industrial Revolution, London's population exploded from 1 million to 4.5 million. And by the Victorian era, especially, London had no more space, and to this end, it became a serious political issue. George Walker was a doctor in Drury Lane, and in 1839 he described the scene at St Anne's Church in Soho. Quote, "Here, in this place of Christian burial, you may see human heads covered with hair, and here, in this consecrated ground are human bodies with flesh still adhering to them. On the north side, a man was digging a grave. He was quite drunk. So indeed were all the grave diggers we saw. A child's coffin, which stopped the man's progress, had just been cut longitudinally, right in half, and there lay the child, wrapped in its shroud, resting upon part of the coffin which remained. The shroud was but little decayed. The outcry became such that on the 18th of March 1842, a committee at the House of Commons was appointed, to which public eyes were opened to a truly scandalous state of affairs in London, and was described by one witness as sickening and horrible, in which exhibited Great Britain through its capital as supposedly the most wealthy, moral, and civilised community in the world. And the committee heard many accounts, including the following from W. Chamberlain, who said, quote, "In the year 1831, I was first employed by Mr. Watkins, the head gravedigger of St. Clement's Churchyard. From that time until the year 1838, I never opened the grave without coming into the coffins of children, grown persons, and what we term odd sizes, which we have been just obliged to cut away, the ground being so excessively full that we could not make a grave without doing it. It was done by the order of Mr. Watkins and Mr. Fitch, the sexton of the parish, that these coffins should be chopped up and the wood placed against the walls and the palings of the ground. We have come to bodies quite perfect, and we've cut away part with choppers and pickaxes. We have opened the lids of coffins, and the bodies have been so perfect that we could distinguish males from females. And all these we've chopped up and cut up. During the time I was at this work, the flesh has been cut into pieces and thrown behind the boards, which are placed to keep the ground up, where the mourners are standing. And when the mourners are gone, this flesh has been thrown in, jammed down, and the coffins taken away and burnt." They heard of one burial ground in Dover Road, still used for numerous interments, although 19 years previous, a witness, clergyman, thought it was scandalous to go on burying there. And of another, St. Margaret's at Westminster, which was reported by commissioners for the improvement of Westminster, the Parliament, earlier in 1814 as unfit to be used much longer, but was still in active operation. And a third at Spa Fields, where there's no more space, but you can always get a grave there. In fact, 30 to 40 people weekly. That is frequently the number of interments. And they said the age of miracles seems to be revived in regards to these burial grounds. St. Martin's in Borough, measuring 295 feet by 379, is supposed to have received within 10 years 14,000 bodies. In St. Mary's in Vinegar Yard, belonging to the parish of Mary le Strand, better than half an acre in size, 20,000 bodies are computed to have been interred within the last half-century, whilst in a vault below a Methodist chapel in the New Kent Road, from 1,600 to 2,000 bodies are to be found, not buried, but heaped up in coffins, nearly all of wood, in a space 40 yards by 25 yards wide and 20 high. The Commission found the following, quote, "The nuisance of interments in large towns and the injury arising to the health of the community from the practice are fully proved. No time ought to be lost by the legislative in applying a remedy. The evidence has also exhibited the singular incidents of the most wealthy, morally and civilised community in the world tolerating a practice and an abuse which has been corrected by years of nearly all civilizations in every part of the globe? The answer was clear. London needed more and bigger graveyards. And like a clock place, many cemeteries were commissioned in the outer lying areas of London, every one 6 miles from central London. And to this end, by the time of the commission, 7 huge cemeteries had been built: Kensal Green, Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Brompton, Nunhead, and Tower Hamlets. And when we think of these Gothic influenced structures, I can't help thinking of that most influential of Victorian horror tales, Dracula. One of the real problems was to stop the present old and slightly more convenient cemeteries continuing with interments, and this was almost immediately stopped with the Burials Act of 1852, passed, which effectively closed cemeteries that had reached capacity, and further acts would continue to cover the full UK over the forthcoming decades. And even a railway was built, especially to deal with the dead. In 1854, the London Necropolis railway station would take bodies and mourners to Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. Sited next to modern-day Waterloo Station, it had many private waiting rooms. It could also hold funeral services. It had storage facilities for bodies, a hydraulic lift to raise the bodies to platform level, and it continued to operate until World War II, thereafter deemed not to be financially viable. And as London has continued to grow and expand, so we continue to have more and more cemeteries. London is indeed a city for the dead, and certainly if anywhere within the old city walls, you probably aren't standing too far from someone's skeletal remains. And lastly for today, a tale of a man who didn't want to be buried in a grave, but when he died, he wanted his body to be thrown overboard at sea for very good reasons. And what followed wasn't criminally illegal in its time, but it was certainly criminally insensitive and disrespectful. This is the story of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant. Byrne was born in Derry in Northern Ireland in 1761. He had pituitary giantism, a condition whereby the growth of tumours on the pituitary gland, located at the base of the brain, causes the gland to malfunction and results in the afflicted person growing to an unusually large height. His condition also caused complications which resulted in acromegaly, a form of distorted bone growth which gradually manifested itself in the most pronounced manner through painful expansion of hands, feet, and his cranial figures. He was widely regarded as being over 8 feet tall as an adult. At the time of his death, his height was recorded at 8 foot 4 inches. However, examination of his skeletal remains suggested that was an exaggeration and an overestimation. He has probably stood about 7 foot 7 inches or 231 centimetres. That's just a wee bit taller than me for sure. Byrne decided to leave Littlebridge in Derry in his late teens, and he set off for a tour of mainland Britain, where he exhibited himself as a human curiosity for money under the stage name Charles O'Brien, and he became a famous and beloved character in the process. First arriving in Edinburgh in 1782, he then found his way to London and ended up in Cockspur Street, Charing Cross. And the following contemporaneous newspaper accounts portray his impact on London. Quote, "However striking a curiosity may be, there is generally some difficulty in engaging the attention of the public, but even this was not the case with the modern living colossus or wonderful Irish giant, for no sooner had he arrived in an elegant apartment at the cane shop in Spring Garden Gate, next door to Cox's Museum, than the curious of all degrees flock to see him, being sensible that a prodigy like this has never made an appearance amongst us before, and that neither the tongue of the most florid orator or the pen of the most ingenious writer can sufficiently describe the elegance, symmetry, and proportion of this wonderful phenomenon in nature, and that all description must fall infinitely short of giving that satisfaction which may be obtained on inspection. So popular was Burn that shortly after his establishment in London in the summer of 1782, a pantomime inspired by him was performed called the Harlequin Teague. And having accrued a comfortable amount of money as a human curiosity after his first year in London, Burn decided to have these earnings adapted into banknotes, apparently to the value of £700. He was notoriously fond of alcohol, and Burn, drinking on Cockspur Street one evening with this note in his person, and he was pickpocketed. And the papers of the time reported on the celebrity's mishap. The Irish giant, a few evenings since, taking a lunar ramble, was tempted to visit the Black Horse, a little public house facing the King's Mews, and before he returned to his own apartments, found himself a less man than he had been at the beginning of the evening, by the loss of upwards of £700 in banknotes, which had been taken out of his pocket. And Burn was greatly distressed when this was stolen from his pocket, and it led to a decline, and he died on the 1st of June, 1783, and the popular account is that his death was caused by excessive drinking, brought on by the vexation at the loss of his savings. Burn was only 22 when he died, and while excessive drink and depression fueled a decline towards death, it seems an obvious conclusion to the contemporary onlooker. It would be perhaps some 100 years before a broader clinical understanding of the giantism. In reality, Burn's body was probably racked with acromegalic pain and the effects of his pituitary condition. Alcohol would have afforded Burn some pain relief, but it's probably his underlying conditions rather than the depression that really caused his deterioration. It's also likely that he contracted tuberculosis. But unsurprisingly, Burn's body greatly intrigued the medical establishment of the time, particularly the surgeons, anatomists. And as Burn became increasingly ill, the surgeons watched the celebrities decline from the wings, and amongst these was John Hunter, the preeminent surgeon of the day. But Burn desired to evade these surgeons. He feared that if buried, body snatchers would exhume him. Therefore, he orally directed his friends to weigh his coffin down and bury him at sea. When the giant passed away on June the 1st, at his apartment, newspaper accounts show the tension between a dying Burn and a medical establishment keen to obtain the celebrity's body played out, and it read as follows. Revelling in the sensational circumstances, the papers record that the whole tribe of surgeons put a claim in for the poor departed Irish giant and surrounded his house, just as Greenland harpooners would an enormous whale. And some days later, the surgeons are becoming more desperate. Quote, so anxious are the surgeons to have possession of the Irish giant, they have offered a ransom of 800 guineas to the undertakers. And as more time passes, the papers referring to Burn's wish to be weighed down and buried at sea, and they observe with ghoulish delight that the body hunters are determined to pursue their valuable prey, even in the profoundest depth of the aquatic regions. and the Edinburgh Evening Current reported that yesterday morning, June the 6th, the body of Byrne, the famous Irish giant who died a few days ago, was carried to Margate in order to be thrown into the sea, agreeable to his own request, he being apprehensive that the surgeons would anatomise him. And it was here that the true tragedy took place. During the transportation, a man in Hunter's pay had Byrne's body secretly swapped in its coffin for dead weight as the journeying party stopped overnight to rest. Hunter was supposed to have paid £500 for the body, and a further accomplice covertly transported the corpse back to Hunter. Hunter immediately reduced Byrne's body to its bones by stripping the flesh in a large boiling cauldron. He then hid the remains away so that any evidence implicating him in the misdeed was out of sight, and when things settled down, he bound the bones together in their correct skeletal arrangement, studied the skeleton, and wrote up his findings. And 4 years passed before Hunter revealed publicly that the skeleton had become a part of his collection of anatomical specimens, and interested parties were invited to view the Irishman's remains. In Byrne's 18th century England, a corpse was considered to be nullus in bonus, that is, the legal ownership of nobody, and the dead bodies came under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And the power vested in the church prior to the 19th century meant that the common law courts did not have jurisdiction over corpses, and moreover, that a person in custody of a dead body was not understood to have ownership right over it. Today, Hunter's enormous specimen collection, the Hunterian Museum, is open to the public free of charge in Royal College of Surgeons, Lincoln's Inn, London. At its centre, in a towering illuminated display case, is a skeleton of Charles Byrne, for many a source of fascination, for others a damnation against common decency and respect for personal funeral wishes. In 2011, calls were made in the British Medical Journal to put an end to the unethical display of Byrne's skeleton at the museum and for it to be buried at sea as Byrne intended for himself. The article argued that Byrne's DNA had been taken and could be used for further research, but it was now time to respect Byrne's funeral wishes and attempt to morally rectify what happened. Well, that's it for another episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I hope you enjoyed that one, and until next time, bye bye.